I'm back to work on this applique quilt uh, using a size 11 in, needle, and it's teeny. I will do a quilter's knot, and to do that I put the thread on top of the needle and pinch it between my thumb and finger, and then I twist around it 3 times. Then I slide those 3 twists down the thread, and that gives me the knot at the, well, it should. Let me do it again. So 3 times around, slide it down. There's the knot. I don't know if that'll even show with the glare, but there's the knot. So you're going to start by burying your knot between your layers, so the needle goes in and comes out wherever it is that you want to start, and then you're going to give it a little tug and that buries the knot. I'm starting with simple outlining of my applique. I need to get the stitches really close to the applique. At least that's what I'd like to do, because that's going to give me a better definition. The applique itself will stand out some. I've used cotton batting in this, and it's quite a thin batting, so there's not going to be a ton of loft to it, puffiness. I picked that kind of batting because it's more what you would have seen in a 1850 quilt from of this style. They did not have a tendency to use big, thick battings for these fancy quilts. In southern quilts that were made for really for use, they often used very thick batting, and you'll see, and they can weigh a ton too, where you can see that the when you look at them, you can see the real thick batting. But on this style quilt, it was less common to have thick batting, so I used a thin cotton, which is probably something similar to what they would have used. And the other advantage, of course, is that thinner batting is easier to quilt. When I first started quilting, the batting that I used was, well, in the first one I ever did, I used a polyester fusible batting, which is the kind where you iron it together instead of basting it. And it was really, really horrible. I almost didn't finish the quilt. It was a cheap brand. There was so much glue in that batting that it was almost impossible to poke a needle through it. I suppose if I'd been doing machine quilting at the time, I would never have noticed. But when you do, when you're doing it by hand, you definitely notice. So I get my outline started here. I'm also going to quilt around the individual applique pieces. So I can go in, I've just poked my needle through the layers, to come out right where I want that to be. Today I'm using a really big hoop. This is a 24-inch handheld hoop, and I don't use this one real often. It's an antique that I found. I don't use this one real often because it is a little bit large, but it seemed like it was going to work really well to get a good camera shot, so that's why I'm using such a big one. The other advantage, of course, to a great big hoop is you don't have to re-hoop it very often. In fact, I would feel really good if I was able to get this whole section in the hoop quilted in one day. That would be almost like a miracle. This quilting through the appliques is a little tougher, and takes a little more force because you're going through an extra layer of fabric. One of the things that people have told me that they have trouble with is that right where the needle, where the thread goes right through the eye of the needle, they'll often find that the thread starts shredding up there and breaks. And I have the solution, and that is every couple of stitches advance the thread on the needle. So it's not always having all the force on that one spot. So you do a couple of stitches and you move it. You do a couple more stitches and you move it some more. So the thread advances on the needle. It won't shred if you keep moving it. Now, I am a turner. So I turn the hoop as I quilt, and right now I'm afraid I just turned it out of the frame. Let's see if I can get it back. There we go. There are quilters who are really good and are able to do the quilting in multiple directions and not turn the hoop. I'm not one of them, so I turn. One of the reasons I like a hoop instead of a frame, because I can keep turning my work. I'm also one of the oddball people who quilt away from myself instead of towards myself. Many quilters will sort of have this whole thing reversed, and that they quilt this way towards themselves. And I can do it, but not nearly as well. So I do what works best for me, and I don't worry about it. So what I'm going to do on the background on this is what I did over here, which is a bunch of echo quilting. And echo quilting is merely following the line that you've previously created over and over again. Imagine what it would look like if you dropped a pebble in a pond. You get ripples, row after row of rippling. And that's basically what echo quilting is about. You just have row after row of lines following lines that grow out from the center. I'm doing it fairly close together in this particular quilt because, again, I'm trying to emulate what they might have done when the quilt top was made, and I've seen some similar era quilts, and they were heavily quilted, very heavily quilted, and so that's where I'm going with this. I want it to look authentic. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? Let's talk about needles. I know some quilters who thread up a whole bunch of needles at once, and they'll actually have them go. I have a bunch of them going all at the same time. You know, they'll be working on this section and they'll finish and they'll leave that needle threaded and stuck into the quilt there, and then they'll have another one over here and they'll have another one, and it drives me insane. It's not to say it's not a viable way to do it. It just they all get in my way, and the rationale behind doing it is that you have less times that you have to rethread and restart, and it saves you time, and doesn't save me any time because I'm constantly getting tangled up in them, and they're always in my way. So it actually, to me, is not a time saver, it's a hindrance, and that's my own personal opinion. So if you're one of those who wants to thread up a whole bunch, there's nothing to say that you can't do that. It's just not something I would do because, like I said, they get in my way. When I put the quilt in the hoop, I also take out most of the safety pins. I just that I've used for basting. I just have a few left here on the edge, just holding it down there. But once it's in the hoop itself is holding the layers together. It's not going to go anywhere, so I don't need those in there. And I'm pretty good at working out any little puckers or things that'll show up as I go. So having those pins out is also a way of, for me, of making less things to get in my way and start to cause me to get my thread tangled up and lose my temper. Let's see. I'm trying to keep my stitches small and consistent. This fabric is not super thin, so it's not the most conducive to really teeny tiny stitches, so I'm not killing myself over that. I'm striving for consistency rather than a million stitches per inch. I'm just trying to make them consistent and pretty. The other thing I should tell you is this is a really short needle, and you may notice that I'm not putting more than a couple, 2 or 3 stitches on the needle at a time before I pull it through. That way I can do it without having to fight with it. If I used if I went crazy and put on, the way some people do, 6, 7, 8 stitches onto the needle before they pulled it through, then I have to stop and figure out how I'm going to get it to go through, and that ends up being, as you can see, a real issue. But if I just put a few on, it slides right through. So that's how I do it. I don't think the end result is any different. I get the same number of stitches per inch. I just don't have to keep stopping and really fighting to get the needle pulled through, and I don't need a separate needle puller or a pair of pliers to pull that needle through. I can just go for it with my hand. That's just the way I find it works best. The other thing that people always want to know, and I never know the answer to, how long did that take you? Well, there's a couple of things that I have thoughts about that. One, I never time this. I never really try to clock total number of hours. I used to count yards of thread, so I would know at the end of a quilt how many yards of thread went into it, and then I would be able to say, well, it takes me about X number of minutes to use up a yard of thread, so the total quilting would have probably taken about X amount of time. I've given up on that too, because I usually have too many quilts going at once with the same, and I use maybe the same spool of thread on a couple of different quilts, and I lose track, and so anyway, I don't know. If I were making a quilt specifically to sell, it would probably be a lot more important for me to know the amount of time that went into it, and what I would probably end up with is this horrible realization that it took way more time than I thought, and I'm essentially giving away my labor because when you make a quilt and it's got 2,000 yards of thread in it, and if it takes you 15 minutes a yard, how many hours is that? And this quilt, by the way, will have way over 2,000 yards. So, anyway, so that's one thought about time, is that I just usually don't keep track. The other thing about how long did it take you to make that, my answer lately is 10 years, and that's not to be a smart aleck. That's to say that I have been quilting for 10 years. I started my first quilt in 2006, and so it's been working on quilting for about 10 years. So what I'm doing now, the quilting that I do now, has all been influenced and made up of all the other quilts I made before it. If I look at the first quilt I ever made, it's very different than what I'm making now. The stitching is different. The skills are different. So part of what I do is really, it changes. A quilt I made 10 years ago is not the same as I would make it today. So what quilting I do now has 10 years of experience behind it. So far, and if I ever get this one done, it might be 11 years by the time I get it done. But so if somebody says, how long did this quilt take you to make? And a reasonable answer is really the total number of years that you've been a quilter. Because everything that at least I'd like to think, every quilt I make, every new one, I learn something new and I become a different, better, or maybe not even better, but just a different quilter. My technique changes, my taste changes, the way I approach the design changes. I could never make the same quilt today as I made 10 years ago. I couldn't do it. I'd like to think that what I do today is better, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is. But it's better for me. It's more, my style evolves and changes. And anyway, I've got a short piece of thread left, so I'm going to show you how I like to finish. And I do a back stitch, so the needle goes into the quilt and between the layers and comes back up next to that row of stitches. I put it in one more time, and because this is a short needle, I like to travel it quite a ways, so then it comes up again a little further down, and then I'll give it a once back before I cut it off. That's instead of a knot, and it's just as secure, I find. You may hear different people tell you different things, but from what I can tell, it's just as secure. So there's next piece of thread, and if there we go. I don't have my my quilting glasses on, because when I have those on I can't see anything else except for close up, and I'm trying to be able to look at the camera and see if I'm in frame and the quilting at the same time, so it's a little tougher to see what I'm doing and thread my needle and such. But anyway, you get the idea of how to start. Did you see that one popped right through? I didn't make my knot big enough. I'm going to put another little bit of knot on there so it doesn't pop through. This one's getting closer to being done. I'm just about, well, this section right here is the border. Now, when you, I have to go back and finish all the trapunto, and I think you can see it in the camera here. This has been stuffed, and this part hasn't. So I still have to do all of that. Not all of it, but a good bit of it needs to be done yet. And when you say, well, I'm almost done because I've just got the border left, don't kid yourself, because it's a wide border, and it's probably nearly as big as the whole quilt if you added up the square inches of it all. So I still have a good bit to go. But often when I'm working on a quilt, I seem to do the most fastest quilting when I feel like the end is in sight. So if it helps you to say, I'm down to the border, so I'm almost done, you can do that. because it really will. You know, it's a mental boost to be able to say you're almost done. But in reality, it's probably not quite as far along as you think. If you've got a wide border, that's still an awful lot of quilting to go. I've had some slightly cooler days of late, and it's making it easier to do hand quilting. I've had days in the summer with even with the air conditioning on, it's just been too stifling to sit under a quilt. At least for very long. So I have not been as good about keeping up with the number of hours that I normally put into hand quilting. But just in case you were curious, it's usually somewhere in the vicinity of 5 or 6 hours a day. You usually start right after dinner, sit down, turn the television on, not because there's anything I want to watch, but because it's convenient noise, just a distraction more than anything else. Sometimes I turn on the radio, but I find myself singing too much when well, not the radio because I don't like anything on that, but put my stereo on and play my favorites, and then I end up spending more time thinking about what's the next song I want to put on and changing and whatnot. I'm not technical enough to have anything fancy. I still have albums, and I also have a lot of CDs. So I end up getting up and changing, and anyway, put the television on, it's noise, and I don't have to worry about it. So I do that, and I'll sit and hand quilt probably from about 6 to 11 or 12, something like that. And that's the only time I usually hand quilt is at night. I work on my other stuff during the day. I have a little knot, not a knot, but a little tangle. There we go. And remember, as you go, when you keep moving that thread up through the eye of the needle so that you keep changing the place where that pressure point is, and then you won't have breaking or weak tangly threads. When I was first learning how to quilt, I was learning by doing. I didn't have anybody show me how, which is probably why I do it so much different than people who actually teach quilting, and why I'm reluctant to teach it myself, is that I do it very differently. Anyway, when I first started doing it, I wasn't quite as good at holding the needle, and I ended up with really sore fingers. not on the bottom, but on the top, my hand that holds the needle. And I'd get holes in my thumb. And so I still have, and I use occasionally, a thimble that goes on my thumb. I don't have it right here next to me, so I can't show you, but I will try to remember to show you next time. And it fits on my thumb, and I use it to push the needle through. I made it out of a piece of copper pipe because I needed something pretty big for my thumb. They make lots and lots of thimbles, but mostly they don't make them for big hands, and it's really hard for me to find one that'll fit. So I think that when I was trying to learn how to quilt, I could never find one that fit, and so I sort of worked out a way to do it without a thimble. Now, since then, I have found thimbles that fit, but now I don't know how to use them, or I don't feel as comfortable using them because I've learned how to do it this way. So every time I try, I feel like I'm all thumbs. But at some time, I think I'll make a concerted effort to do some quilting with a thimble every day, and then I'll get more accustomed to it. So I'll get a good section of this border done, and then I'll try to do a wide shot so you can see the whole thing. It's really quite a quilt. I don't know who made this 100 years ago, how many years ago? Probably 1850 or 60-ish. Whoever made the top did a nice job. I've got an amazing amount of respect for those old quilters who did everything with tools that we would consider very primitive today. They didn't have fancy templates and template plastic and tracing and light boxes and marking tools and all that kind of stuff. Their methods were much more primitive, and they did beautiful work. So anyway, I'm going to keep working away at this, and I will show you some progress soon. Meanwhile, happy quilting.